Today I'm going to be talking to you about how to spot an AI generated pattern if you are browsing one of the infinite number of pattern websites available online for your next pattern to make. So question number one is, why do we want to be able to spot and screen out AI generated patterns? Well, the first reason for me is probably the ethical reason. Keep in mind, AI does not write anything. AI doesn't write any poetry or stories or books. AI doesn't create music. AI doesn't create, build, discover new crochet or knitting patterns. These AI things that you find online are based on large language models. This generative AI is consuming and sponging off of and stealing the original creative intellectual property of other creators who have made these things and using an internal formula model, spitting out something else that sounds like, looks like, is based upon creative work that actually belongs to and was made by somebody else. And because AI doesn't knit and AI doesn't crochet and AI doesn't play instruments and AI doesn't do these things, it's not an original creation. So reason number one that we probably want to spot AI generated patterns is the ethical reason. Big reason number two is they won't work. The thing that people think that they are downloading or purchasing online that is AI generated is not a knitting pattern or a crochet pattern. It is a string of words that sound like what other folks may have written in patterns that did work, but reconfigured, reordered, reconstructed in a way that's not actually going to produce an item that you want to make. It's not going to make a sweater that's wearable. It's not going to make a hat that you want to gift to somebody. It's not going to make a plushie that is as cute or cuddly or unique as you were hoping that it would be. So how do we know if the picture that we're looking at or the pattern that we're seeing advertised on one of these websites or one of these social media sites is a real pattern that's going to produce something that looks like the picture that we're seeing, especially now that the AI generated images used to advertise these patterns seem so very compelling, and are sometimes harder to distinguish between a real knit or real crocheted item, especially for somebody who may be a beginner in making that type of project or might be joining the craft. So the first thing to look for, especially looking at some of these examples here in the pictures, are shapes or structures that can't actually be made through the craft that you're looking at. It can't actually be crocheted to look that way, can't actually be knit to look that way. Some of the dead giveaways that I look for is, are there shapes that cannot be created out of fabric and fluff? Or is there drape on the garment that can't be created with the crochet or the knit that we're looking at? So for example, if we are looking at a plush item like these that we see here, these particular items can't be created with crochet and fluff. When you crochet an item, what you're going to end up with is a series of round structures that are sewn together, either round or cylinder or tube-like. You're not going to get boxy structures. You're not going to get sharp corners on a square. You're not going to get rigid structures. There are strategies and techniques we can use, like using pipe cleaner that we're crocheting over to help shape ears or to hold wings a certain way or to pose arms, but they aren't going to be rigid. They're not going to be stronger than a pipe cleaner would be otherwise. And all of these items are stuffed with fluff, so they're going to have a pillowy consistency. They're not going to be able to hold rigid poses unless we're sewing them in that way. And in these two particular examples, we're seeing shapes that would not be easily built from a series of either circles or cylinders or tubes to create the design that we're seeing. Also look closely at the textures of the finished object. It is possible to brush yarn or to comb yarn after after the item is knitted and there are loose pieces of thread kind of left stringing like a hair or fluff. It's possible to brush that so it fuzzes out. it's going to look like fuzzy yarn. It's not going to have the texture of fur or hair. So for example, in the puppy, how furry and soft the fur on the finished item's chest looks, we're not going to achieve that using an acrylic yarn that is brushed out afterwards. Especially if the plush item is being advertised, if the pattern is being advertised as a no-sew item. You're not going to find a lot of complex shapes and structures connected together because that's not going to happen organically as you crochet or you knit. At the most, you'll be making lots of small pieces that then you are painstakingly sewing together. And speaking of taking a closer look at the intricate details in the finished item, if you look closely at these examples of fairies that I show here, there are elements of these details that can't be easily created with crochet or that are inconsistent with crochet. The first tell that I really zero in on are the details on the hands and the high heels for this particular stuffy. There is not a way to easily articulate individual digits on a hand or the high heel that we see here. And it certainly would not enable the figure to stand. Again, crochet items are soft and they are built on fluff and maybe a bit of pipe cleaner or wire on the inside. In order to create a cylinder small enough to be the heel on a shoe or a thumb on a hand, and what looks like a item used with very thin yarn, would be incredibly difficult. It would be impossible. The other thing I zero in on from a detail perspective is the hair on the fairy. It starts off looking like perhaps it could be a chain stitch. And of course, if you crochet, you recognize that a chain stitch is going to look like a braid. So here we have a braid. And this is a weight 3 yarn. So it's not a teeny thread yarn, but it's not a worsted weight either. This is a lighter yarn. And you can see I still have a pretty thick braid going. And you also see that it hangs straight. So the hair detail on the fairy, the example that I was showing you, doesn't hang straight, it hangs in curls. A chain stitch is not going to curl. There is a way to achieve the curl, but it involves doing a chain stitch and then single crocheting back up along that chain stitch to create something like this. As you can see, this hangs in that nice little ringlet. However, I also want to call your attention to the thickness that it creates to have a chain stitch that then I single crochet back up. So yes, I can create a nice little spiral curl that could be part of that fairy's hair, but it's not going to be as thin as what you see in the picture, and it's not going to be a single braid. It's going to look like this. Also, if you look along the bottom of that hair where we've got that nice, lovely, what appears to be, but is AI generated chain going, it looks like it ends in hair, individual strands, individual silky strands, not yarn like this. And this, if I brushed it out, would again be fluffy, furry looking acrylic yarn. It wouldn't hang in strands like hair. Now, could you attach doll hair, patch through that to make it look like we have chains, which again are curling here, but would not curl in real life, interspersed with doll hair? Sure. But this particular pattern was marketed as no-sew. And you're not going to get doll hair interspersed with crochet in a no-sew pattern. It's not possible. Another piece to clue into are the patterns of the stitches themselves. And so using the example of crochet again, we get our round shapes in crochet by starting with a central point and doing a series of increases. So we spiral out row by row. And then we might do a couple of rows with the same number of stitches and then do some decreases, right? And that's what gives us a rounder shape. And depending on the pattern and the number of rows you are doing, you'll get more round or more egg shape. It just depends on what you're going for. But one thing that is true is, except for where we do our increases and our decreases, each of those stitches is going to stack one on top of the other. So you can see in my little example here of what would potentially become a little yellow trademarked Pocket Monster stuffy, we can see there's a stitch in this row and one directly above it and one directly above it. Crochet stitches stack. The same thing is true for knit, such as in this beanie. If I tuck the top part down so you can just see the pattern itself of the stockinette, you can see one stitch on top of one stitch on top of one stitch. We have vertical rows of stitches. Many times with these AI generated images for patterns that are not real patterns, when you look closely, if you zoom in, we don't have the stacking, or we have variable numbers of stitches per row. That's not to say we can't increase or decrease, but you can see increases and decreases. So for example, with my little yellow Pocket Monsters head here, where there are decreases, there might be a spot where there are two stitches that come together and make one stitch, or a spot where one stitch appears to split into two stitches, but the row below, those stitches will still stack, right? It'll be visible that there's a split or a decrease. Even if I'm using an invisible decrease, you'll be able to see, okay, that stitch split into two stitches, but the rows underneath stack. Even more so with knitting, you can see as I was doing the decreases for the top of this beanie, here is a spot with a decrease, and we can see two stitches decrease down to one stitch, but the other stitches in between are still stacked. And there's a visible pattern, there's a predictive pattern to how those are decreasing each round. And a consistent number of stitches in between. This is one continuous stitch column that runs all the way up until it is decreased as part of the pattern. Another thing to pay attention to if trying to decide, especially if a pattern that you're seeing for a plushie is a real plushie versus an AI generated image, is how the pieces come together. So here I have the beginnings of a creepy little fella I was making for the upcoming Halloween season. And already it's a very simple design. He's going to have arms and other pieces, obviously. This is not a no-sew pattern. We have a head here, just like I was telling you about earlier. And you can see even in this dark yarn that the stitches stack one on top of the other. We have a body that was done from the bottom up with two cylinders for the legs being joined together with a bigger cylinder for the body and then decreasing to bring us to a neck shape. But what you see here in the middle is where these pieces were sewn together. And as we look at where these pieces are sewn together, you can see this is not a small, dainty little neck. This is not a doll-like neck. This is not a Barbie neck. This is a wider cylinder that connected, right? We don't have shoulders here. We don't have a bodice shaping. We don't have human-like proportions that you would see in a plastic doll that was manufactured. We don't have the kind of body shaping that you would see in those elf pictures, right? Where it seems like there's a bodice narrowing down to a waist, because we can't achieve that, especially in a no-sew pattern for a stuffy. Instead, what we have is, again, a series of cylinders stacking together with rounds. That's not to say that we can't make complex stuffed items using crochet or knit, as the case may be, but it's not going to be no-sew, and it's not going to have the same kind of proportions or the thinness, the narrowness to it that a plastic item will, and it's not going to look like something that's AI generated. Another really good way to determine if the pattern that you are considering is AI generated is taking a deeper dive into the comment section or the reviews attached to the pattern to see what other folks are saying, especially folks who purchased the pattern and attempted it. So comments like these pointing out that the pattern doesn't match the photo at all, or that the instructions included in the pattern produce something more simplistic by way of the hair looks than luxurious looking doll hair that's shown in the image, poor service, or lack of follow through, or unresponsiveness to questions are red flags as well. Most independent designers, if you reach out to them with questions, will offer feedback or suggestions on how to create the pattern that you have purchased for them. And many independent pattern producers create updates based on feedback that they're receiving from folks who are using their patterns out in the world and are pushing those out to people who have ordered the patterns previously. So, what are some ways to know that the pattern that we're purchasing are created by an actual human crochet designer or knit designer or other type of craft designer and being offered to the public so that they can reproduce these beautiful works themselves? So the first thing is, besides taking a look at the reviews or the comments and looking for folks who are calling out this is AI, is to check out that designer's social media. Folks out there in the knitting and the crochet world who are doing a lot of design and offering a lot of patterns to folks are often very active on social media. It's where they are interacting with folks who are also in the craft. It's where they are recruiting test knitters or test crocheters, which I'll talk about here in just a minute. And they're posting patterns and images, not just of their design process and the items that they've created, they're also posting the end results of patterns and created objects made by folks who are test knitting for them. So checking out their social media, looking at the designer like on Instagram or on Ravelry are good ways to determine, is this somebody who is creating this object with their own human knowledge and ingenuity and creativity for other humans to be creating. I also want to take this opportunity to put a plug out there for folks who enjoy knitting and crocheting to consider maybe being a test knitter or a test crocheter for folks who are developing patterns and getting them out there. The tee that I'm wearing right now is a pattern that I test knit a few years ago. This is the Unstoppable tee. I didn't design it, I was just a test knitter for it. But I'll list a link to it in the comments for this video as well. It was an enjoyable process. I have a copy of the pattern, obviously, from having created the test object for it, was able to provide feedback for how it worked out for me and how it's the measurements and the dimensions ended up working for my body type and help contribute to the development of the pattern. Test knitting and test crocheting is a great way to expand your own skill set. It also helps build your fluency with pattern terminology, pattern convention. It helps you to recognize this is what patterns typically look like. This is the type of detail or instructions that typically come through. And it helps to make sure that high quality patterns are continued to be available to the public. And then the last thing I will add has to do with the price for patterns. This is something that comes up off and on in some of the online conversation I see around how to tell if a pattern is AI or not. It is not unusual to see patterns for tees, shirts, sweaters, ponchos, larger items that you might create to be selling for $6 or $7 or even $10 online. And it makes sense when you think about the hours and hours and hours that go into designing the pattern, helping to arrange for test knitters or test crocheters, the pattern editing, the tech editing that goes into it to make sure that what is written translates into directly what was done to create the prototype and is reproducible for folks at home as well. So it's not weird or unusual to see a pattern that costs $6, $7, $8, $9, $10, especially again for a wearable or something larger. Are there patterns out there that are less expensive? 99 cents, $1.99, $2.99? Sure. Often those are for smaller items or accessory items. And is it possible to find high quality free patterns available as well? Yeah, sure. People have lots of reasons for putting out patterns at different price points. It's not unusual for a designer to have an older pattern or a more simple pattern available at very low cost or free. It's not unusual to see promotions or coupons. It's not unusual to see a free pattern kind of offered as a way to help bring traffic to the individual designer's website, to help get their information out more broadly in these algorithms. We're all trying to figure that out. Or as a way to introduce new customers, new crafters to the kind of work that we're doing from a pattern design standpoint. And also, it's not the rule that, or it's not the most common thing that we're going to find free patterns available for large or complicated items. So I'm interested to hear from you. What are some tips that you use to help determine for yourself Is this pattern or this item that you're looking at something that was probably designed by a human crafter for other human crafters? Or is this something that is more likely to have been AI generated and is going to come with a pattern that doesn't create something that you really enjoy using, wearing, or gifting to somebody else? Please drop a comment below and let me know some of the things you're looking for. Also, if you'd like to see more from me, please like, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you again soon.